Welcome to CTO Insights, where we unpack the strategies behind high-performing engineering teams. I'm your host, Katerina, and today I have the pleasure to welcome Allison McMillan, founder of Tavlin Consulting and Fractional VP of Engineering for various organizations. Allison specializes in delivering results and driving growth in high-performing engineering teams, and I'm thrilled for the opportunity to get her insights. In our conversation, we cover strategies for planning and budgeting business priorities from the CTO perspective, delving into creative approaches to ensure innovation doesn't suffer when faced with financial constraints. We discuss team productivity and the importance of proper meeting strategies that allow for uninterrupted, meaningful work. Covering product planning, delivery life cycles, metrics, and scaling teams, Allison takes us through the full CTO journey, unpacking her insights every step of the way. Stay tuned and don't forget to subscribe for more insights into creating high-performing teams and standout products. This episode is brought to you by Adiva, a global network of top developers connecting businesses with world-class talent. Whether you need to scale your team or bring an idea to life, Adiva empowers you to increase your engineering capacity without the overhead of traditional hiring. Visit adiva.it to learn more. Allison, welcome. Thank you for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Let's start with a quick kind of overview of what you do at Tavlin Consulting. You've had a career that spanned a lot of leadership roles in companies like GitHub, Quarterpath, and now you're working as fractional VP of engineering with various companies. What is the main role that you're taking and what challenges do you help solve?
Yeah, so I like to say basically I help people communicate and work together more effectively. And I do that in a few different ways, right? Through my fractional work, that's really joining a company, sort of holding that VP of engineering seat, for companies of a certain size, certain stage, to help work through, issues or challenges or whatnot that team is facing at that time, at that point in the company's history and where the company is at and how to sort of move forward and move the company forward. I also do that through one-on-one mentoring. Those are, again, really one-on-one sessions with problems or issues or concerns that folks are bringing to me. And then finally, I design and facilitate workshops, trainings, and offsites and retreats. And a lot of those, right, there's a lot that goes into those, but common goals are, we want a high-performing team. We want folks who can collaborate and communicate more effectively. We have some of these areas that we want to discuss or dive into while we're in person, and really helping teams figure out how to utilize that time effectively and how to design it in a way that is engaging and interesting and leads to those actual actionable outcomes. That's something that I love doing and that I dig into a lot. So, but really, right, each of those specific services are all just about helping people communicate better.
And helping, teams perform well. So I think that's the main reason why we have this discussion today, because I really want to get your insights into everything around creating high-performing teams.
Yeah. Teams that communicate better they're higher performing, they're more collaborative, they're more connected. They're likely to stay at the company longer. There's a whole bunch of different areas that really sort of like improving that baseline communication and how people work together raises a whole bunch of other metrics and aspects.
Great. We're at that, period of the year where everyone starts with the new priorities. Until recently, it was all planning and budgeting and everything. So I guess it's appropriate to start there. What are some strategies from CTO perspective that we could use for planning properly and budgeting the tech projects and the product basically within companies?
Yeah. I mean, a lot of this, right, the planning phase and then actually starting to move into execution. This is where, the rubber meets the road, as they say, right? I think that as you're planning, it's really about looking at capacity, understanding capacity, and understanding what we as engineers need to do and what the business impact of that is. So there's sort of a bunch of pieces of the puzzle that come together, right? There's, okay, what do we as engineering need to do? What's the business impact of that? How do we articulate that? Then it's also looking at the product list, right? Sales, product, customer conversations, advisory boards. What are they seeing as company growth, as ARR targets, as adoption targets and rates? What does that look like for the year? And what are the assumptions about what needs to be shipped or done or happen in order to meet those targets and those goals? And then you also have to account for interrupt work, bugs, vacations, sick time, depending on how your company does on call. Frequently, we forget to also count in the weeks or the times that an engineer is potentially outside of any of this work because they're focused on that on-call work. And then you have to smush all of that together. And really, right, and that's where the real sort of negotiation and prioritization happens. Okay, given all of these different wish lists, how are we then comparing apples to apples? What is the business impact of each of these things? What level of effort do we think it's going to take? And of each of those, like, how confident are we in that level of how confident are we in that level of effort? Where do we think there's risk, where we're making some assumptions, but that, level of effort might shift drastically? And then aligning all of that with capacity and how many people do we have? And I think when you're looking at annual planning and budgeting, that's also where you can say, okay, where do we want to draw the line? If we want to draw the line based on current capacity, this is what that looks like. If we feel like that is actually not sufficient and we really need to add these few things to meet our ARR goals, to meet additional company goals, cool. Just means that we need additional capacity. And so how do we make sure to add that in? Last thing I'll add here is that one, I think, mistake that sometimes companies make when they're like, okay, yes, we need capacity. And so we'll add some headcount and that will move our capacity line, past a few more things, is that people forget that it takes time to hire and to find and to onboard. And so I see a lot of assumptions, especially coming out of annual planning, that assume day one, we have someone on board. They're completely knowledgeable about our process, our systems, our code base, et cetera. So, even if you do that negotiation in annual planning and decide yes, we do need additional headcount, making sure to account for what does that look like based on the market, based on partners, based on a whole lot of factors.
And with the state of the industry right now and all the layoffs and the hiring freezes, budget limitations, all of that, how would you ensure that the priorities go through, innovation doesn't suffer? How do you account for that within the planning process?
Yeah, it is really tough, and it's really, really important not to burn out engineers. I think, the concern a couple of years ago was we will burn engineers out and they'll leave, and then we'll need to hire and spend time hiring and onboarding. I honestly think these days the concern is more we'll burn out engineers and they actually won't leave because of sort of where and how the market is. And then it's a matter of we make assumptions based on past performance of, capacity, effort, what a team can handle, what their sort of general-ish velocity looks like. I don't like to look specifically solely at a velocity metric, but you have an idea, you have an ish, and if somebody is burnt out and they're not working at that capacity or they need additional vacation time, right? I think in the market today, those individuals are less likely to leave. And so that opens up a different set of conversations that need to happen. So super, super important not to burn out engineers. I think some of the ways that you can think creatively with sort of tight budgets and limited resources is a little bit about these things that we want to do. What does that mean, right? the number of times that I've been in a room and there have been 5 people talking about a feature or a thing, and if you ask each person to define, like, if you were to give a 1-sentence elevator pitch or like the top 5 bullet points of the requirements of this feature, like, what is that elevator pitch and what are those top 5 needs? And it changes from, like CTO, product manager, head of product manager, engineering manager, lead engineer, right? Like whoever is sort of customer success, whoever is involved in that conversation, it can frequently be like extremely different sort of what people are thinking a feature actually needs or what it looks like. And so I think one thing that a lot of companies don't stop to do, but should stop to do is, are we all thinking about this need and solving this problem in the same way? And if we take a step back, if we're looking at this feature or this set of features, can we take a step back and really make sure that we collectively understand the problem that we're solving? And to solve that problem, is this the only way to solve that problem? Or is there a build versus buy solution? Is there an MVP solution? Is there a one customer, future many customers phasing, right? There are frequently ways to sort of get alignment and take a step back and sort of think a little bit about, have we scoped this too big? Is there a way to still meet these generally really aggressive goals these days around adoption, ARR, year over year revenue growth, et cetera, that take into account our capacity and potentially boil it down in a slightly different way?
Makes sense. Moving to scaling and growth, I want to discuss about, keeping that high performance when scaling the team. What are the main structural changes, the challenges as the teams grow? And maybe you can take us through some of your past experience, working with a smaller team and then all of the struggles and challenges, and then going back to the high performance routes after you solved all of that.
Yeah. So as a company grows, right, frequently the things there's additional layers of management that are put in place, right? Teams need to split up into, smaller sub areas, or, you're hiring a bunch of people, somebody has too many direct reports. It makes sense to add a layer of management somewhere. I think that the big issues that I see for scaling are things like siloing of information, increased coordination costs, dependencies on other teams, right? And understanding like what each team's roadmap is. I think honestly, like it always comes down to communication. I think it always comes down to communication, and where are the spaces and places that you're de-siloing information, you are coordinating, that you're understanding what the dependencies are on other teams. I think that also how we think about high performing teams needs to shift a little bit as you scale, right? So when you're a startup, a high performing team, is one that maybe like ships quickly, comes up with creative solutions, right? And I think that as you hire and scale, oftentimes the concern is like, oh, we're moving so slowly, or it feels like we're moving slowly. How come the team isn't shipping as quickly anymore? But frequently, like, the team isn't shipping as quickly because the customer base has changed a little bit. And so what you need for security, compliance, some of those like boxes that you have to check are different. How you have to design a technical system to scale is different. There are different considerations that need to be taken into account. Not just, okay, can we get this out quickly so that we win the customer, but like, how does this architecture affect other customers, affect other areas of the code base. And the code base is just larger. And you're like you could go a little while without like feeling the tech debt that you created or that you are creating. But I think also like when you're actually like scaling teams, right, that's when you really start to like feel that tech debt more, because it's, again, complex systems, et cetera. And so I think a little bit of like what even a high performing team means in like a early stage scrappy startup, because honestly, as you're scaling, you don't want your engineering team operating in that same way that they did when you were like small and scrappy and just trying to figure out if you were going to survive or not. And so you actually don't want to be measuring them in a high performance way, I think, in the same ways, right? Obviously, you want to remove friction, make sure that ships are still fast, make sure that, there's predictability, there's estimates, there's those sorts of things there. But you actually don't want them to take the scrappiest, shortcuttiest way as the path forward necessarily all the time.
Yeah, but on the other hand, I think a lot of times companies at that stage just try to create too much structure, and then that becomes the bottleneck. So how do we balance this?
Yeah, I think my approach is like, I think this is also when a company is scaling, there can also be a risk of being like, okay, well, I've read these 5 books and like, this is what these people say to do. And so we're going to like put in this structure. We're going to do like this range of ceremonies. This is exactly how we're going to operate, et cetera. I think that you need to solve the problems that come up, right? Instead of, I think especially at the scale up phase, there's sometimes a desire to try to shortcut problems and be like, oh, if we put this in place now, it won't be a problem in the future. That might be the case, but you also might be adding a lot of like overhead and bureaucracy and layers and process where it really doesn't need to be. It's really about, as pain points come up, as problems come up, addressing those and really understanding also like not necessarily what the surface problem is, right? Not necessarily what somebody comes to me or comes to their engineering manager about. That's usually like, okay, this is what the problem appears to be. But as you like ask additional questions and get really curious and sort of dig in, sometimes you can solve a number of pain points that are actually all related with one process fix or with one additional piece of guidance on an expectation and alignment there. And so not trying to put everything in place all at once, I think is really important.
And when it comes to hiring new people and onboarding and ensuring high retention for the new hires, what do you have any specific process that you follow? And also like screening for, I wouldn't say screening for high performance, but how does this person fit in the culture, or how does this person contribute to the culture that we want to establish that is all about high performing teams and enabling the others to perform at their best?
So in terms of hiring, I think that every team is really a puzzle that needs to be put together, and every puzzle piece is really, really important to the whole. So actually a lot of my experience in this comes from before I moved into tech, where I used to staff these immersion experience trip for college students. And we would have hundreds of applicants, and I needed to sort of like divide them into buses so that they were, on the trip with their busmate. And part of that was thinking about, of these hundreds of applicants that I have, how do I put them into buses of about 40 people in a way that the dynamics of what happens, because who you were on a bus with and what that experience was like really had an enormous impact on the success of the trip as a whole, and how the trip itself like became this like life-changing transformational experience. And so I put together these buses based on sort of like first, and there wasn't a lot of time to like really deeply get to know each of these individuals, but really putting together the buses in a way that, you picked out sort of like personalities and dynamics and how people would fit together and flow together and what each person would bring to that bus and to that experience that would likely enhance the experience of everybody else on the bus as well. So that is how I think about team building today. And so we often, when we're looking for a hire, we think about what are the skills, what are the technical skills that we need. Okay, yes, like stack, years of experience, right? Like what expertise they have to have, et cetera. And then we often think about, okay, and what are the non-technical skills? They can work remotely. They're an effective communicator. They collaborate effectively. Those sort of like will change slightly from company to company. But I think that a really important piece also is what is your team, department, or company missing that ideally this person will fill that gap? Is it somebody who like takes an extra few minutes to like quietly think before they jump in or like provide feedback? Is it somebody who's like a hype person who's always excited and who can really like get the rest of the group into something? Is it someone who, right, there's all these different parts and pieces. I think that's like the richness of tech these days, is that we have a lot of people coming into tech for the last number of years from a variety of careers. It's not necessarily like just a solely traditional path. And so now that might not be on your job description. It might not be sort of like a must have, but I think in terms of like thinking about who you want to add to the team, thinking about that puzzle and what puzzle piece is missing, because clicking that puzzle piece into place, adding that person is going to make the whole picture a little bit more complete, a little bit better. So in terms of hiring, I think thinking really, really deeply about that. And then, I like to ask situational questions, really sort of real life experience. Tell me about a time that you, those sorts of things. So that's, and I will say, I'll add this, trying to really craft a humane job interview process. I know right now it's an employer's market. There are a number of folks on the looking for work. And I think that as a result, some of these hiring processes have gotten a little out of hand, where they are very long, they're very arduous. And I think that they lose a little bit of focus around wanting to make it a good experience for the candidate as well, and really narrowing down on, instead of thinking like, well, I have so many people to choose from, I can ask them a trillion questions so that I pick exactly the right person, really thinking about like, who is this person that I truly need, and what skills do they have and do they bring? So that was a lot on the hiring side.
I want to add on this. I love the point that you made. I've seen a lot of companies that, are trying to find the right person by adding this final step of a kind of like a cultural interview stage where they discuss how the person fits into the company culture. And it's usually the same set of questions, and whether the person is aligned with their values and aligned with the way they do work. But, this is so refreshing, thinking about what is unique about this person and how do they fit within the puzzle, and what piece are we missing right now. I think that's it's transforming the way, you're approaching that cultural fit. It's not a cultural fit, but it's a puzzle fit, right?
Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah. And then in terms of sort of the onboarding and retention piece, so I think onboarding, having a plan for them, having them know, okay, this is what I expect from you in the first week, in the first 2 weeks, in the first month. I personally, this is like a hot take, I don't love like a 30, 60, 90, because honestly, to me, setting 90-day goals is like, you should really be like up and running before ideally before the 90-day mark. So I'll do like a very clear 30 and like a revisited sort of 60-day, so that we're just like aligned and making sure to check in. But as long as you have a clear understanding and you're communicating very clearly, like, these are the things I want you to be tackling, these are the things I want you to be owning, et cetera, within X amount of time. And I'll always say, like, does that feel reasonable? The first couple of weeks of checking in, like, okay, does it still feel reasonable? How can I support? What does that look like? Because everybody also has a different onboarding style and ramp style, right? Some people just like to like jump in and own all the things and like ask for help if they have questions. Other people are like, I want to watch a peer or watch my manager do something a few times before I take it on, or I want to sort of like run it by them as a gut check. So being able to have some of that adaptive leadership style and be flexible around that, I think, is important. And then when it comes to retention, I think good one-on-ones are really important. And what I mean when I say a good one-on-one is that there's helpful feedback, that there's empathy, that there's understanding, that there's really sort of like getting to know who the person is. Again, when I look at sort of the places of communication, one-on-ones are a really solid place where you build rapport and you build up that communication. Other things, right? Providing helpful feedback, having career levels with clear expectations around impact, behavior, et cetera. I personally like to have, this like doesn't necessarily always scale, but I do think that there are ways for it to scale. I like to have a little bit of an idea of what everybody in engineering's career goals are. Not in depth, not like manager level, like here's your goal plan, but just a broad sense of like, this person wants an opportunity to work in another language. This person really likes fast moving projects that are very iterative and a little bit of like a ball of mud when they start. Just a little bit of like a sense of that so that I can talk with their manager or director and help sort of like potentially offer opportunities or provide opportunities as they arise. And then there's so much about retention. I mean, understanding, especially with scaling, right? Like understanding what problems are coming up and acknowledging them, right? Even if I can't or sometimes don't want to do anything about them, there are sometimes problems that arise and I'm just sort of like, this is actually part of this process. We're not going to solve this right now because we will get through it. Let's see what it is in 2 months or in 3 months. But I'm also like really transparent about that, right? Like I tell people like, I have heard you and I understand, and I'm not going to jump in with a solution for this right now, but we will revisit this in this amount of time to see if it is still a problem. Figuring out on that same line, like what can be fixed relatively quickly, because those are like, we should definitely put those things in place. And then, I always come back to communication, and I will say like in-person gatherings and making sure that time is like really time well spent, right? If you want a high-performing team, if you want to continue having that connectiveness and maintaining some of that cultural DNA as you scale, making sure that you're making the time and space for people to get together and that you're really, really thoughtful about what happens in that time together. Ideally in person, virtual can also be really great if it's planned really thoughtfully and effectively. So there's a lot there with retention, but yeah.
I mean, when you said that you were focusing on how to organize the buses, I can imagine how much detail goes there. But maybe some, quick, 5 bullet points of good gatherings. What should they include?
Good gatherings. Goals that we understand what you're trying to achieve. So not just sort of like get everyone together or like align on X, but really sort of like, okay, beyond that, what is the goal? Actionable outcomes. So not just like, we hope everybody will walk away with blah, 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 but like, what are they actually like physically walking away with? Are they walking away with like a copy of the roadmap? Are they walking away with some action items based on some problems that the team is facing? Are they walking away with 3 coffees scheduled, virtual coffees scheduled with teammates over the next 3 weeks, right? Like, what are those actual actionable outcomes? And then I think the other thing is, I have like not a solid rule, but I sort of have like a no presentations or like a no presentations that are over 5 to 8 minutes rule. Because there are so many excellent ways to convey information and to get people really engaged and involved with information consumption, right? Sometimes there's an assumption like, well, we have to do the PowerPoint so that everybody gets this information so that we can have the discussion. That is not true. And there are lots of really interesting, effective ways to also consume that information that are not, just presentation style. So I would say that's one of my 3 is just really sort of like engaging, dynamic, construction and design of what the sessions look like. And then I would say I'll give 4. My last one is, using what I call the negative space effectively, right? So every offsite should have breaks and should have, downtime and things like that. But how you continue to optionally use that time to add to the experience, to build the experience, and to create the connections and continue meeting your goals in ways that are not structured sessions, is because, again, you're bringing everyone together. Like, that time is really, really important. You want to use every minute. Using every minute does not mean that everybody has to be in a session, in a structured session from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. every single day.
That's amazing. One last thing on hiring. I want to talk about balancing working with contractors and internal hiring. It has, especially after the pandemic, it has become a trend for companies to engage contractors more and more. And for people, it is, opportunities that don't know borders. So it's much easier for everyone to collaborate. But how do you balance properly? Do you have any methods or processes for when to go to working with contractors? When do you want to keep internal hires? Or maybe when do you convert people to permanent employees? Like, any strategies around that?
When people think about contractors or sort of using contractors, there's, I think one of the pieces of the conversation has to be what work makes sense for somebody external to handle, right? And I think that that's both a part and piece of like, how easy is it to, like, if somebody has to know the entire code base, it's going to be a different timeline, contracting relationship, et cetera, than if it's like, okay, we're building this new service and actually it's completely standalone and it only needs to hook into the system in these ways, right? The more that I think you can get a project or a thing that is a little bit more standalone, the easier it is to bring contractors on board. The other thing that I like to think about or look at when I'm looking at contractors is what brings the full-time team joy versus what doesn't bring them joy. It's never fun when an engineering team watches a really exciting, interesting project go to an external team or to contractors because the tech debt is too complex to outsource, or because like some of the pieces of like toil and grind, or like some of the brownfield stuff is too difficult. So they internally have to handle the brownfield stuff and somebody else gets to handle like the writing code from scratch greenfield stuff. I think that that's definitely like an aspect and something to think about. Just what sometimes bringing in people from the outside can be a really amazing morale boost because they're bringing in new perspectives and they're bringing in, sort of like energy without having to bring in that full like FTE headcount. But other times it can lower morale if you're not thinking about how the projects and what you're what you're giving them will impact the team. But I think ultimately where I've seen things go poorly or well with contractors is when there's a clear understanding of what the expectations are, right? Is the expectation staff augmentation where they are joining a team and they are fully embedded and they are operating like 100% just as a part of that team, in which case the onboarding looks very similar to how you'd onboard a full-time hire and sort of what that looks like is very similar? Or are they building something that's a little more standalone? If so, are there clear expectations there about requirements and timelines and how the communication loop will work when there are delays? Because there are always delays, because there are always unknown unknowns when you walk into any of these projects. And, how will those things be raised, discussed, and solved? I think if you have a good idea of those aspects and there's a need, right? You have things that you want to tackle that you don't have the capacity to tackle, understanding and knowing what that looks like and how to communicate effectively, I think is the thing that makes it the most successful.
Going back to high-performing teams, so we talked about communication a lot. If you were to sum up the steps or the things to keep in mind when building a high-performing culture and onboarding a team or setting them up for success, what are the main things that you would include in the list?
Yeah, so I tell folks I always hire for the same three things. Everything else is like based on the company, based on the team, based on all sorts of stuff. For me, the baseline is somebody who has a growth mindset. So they are interested in learning. They want to learn. It's okay if they need support there, but they're not afraid to sort of tackle new challenges and have new experiences. They are kind, being able to communicate with kindness, to operate with kindness, to really have that as a core value is super important to me. And then somebody who's collaborative, right? They want to communicate, they want to collaborate, they want to make their life and all of the working lives of the people around them better, and they want to do that together. So I would say, in terms of like the baseline, I think what system you use, what framework you use, all of that, how you scale, what you scale first, how you structure teams, all of that changes based on the company and what that looks like. But for me, baseline is like, if you hire people who have a growth mindset, are collaborative, and are kind, you have set yourself up, at least in that way, for success.
When we were talking about the scaling startups and the differences between smaller teams, and now that the startup grows, the changes and the expectations of high performance, you mentioned that things look differently and different things should be valued at both stages. How do you organize, like if we are going into more detail about planning and work organization and delivery life cycles, what is, in your experience, the best way to, organize work that supports productivity? Because agile companies have become much less agile the more they try to go by the book. And I want to understand practical approaches more.
Yeah. So my answer for this one is a very engineering answer and not a very satisfying answer, which is it depends. So when I look at processes or how a team is working and what that looks like, I think there is frequently a desire to say, we're an agile shop, we use ShapeUp, we're Kanban, and sort of pick a methodology and stick to that and only that. I take a little bit more of a hodgepodge approach, where I think that there are excellent things about each of those styles. And in each of them, what works and doesn't work for a team you can actually pull parts and pieces if you understand. What I like to do is understand, how does engineering need to work, right? Like, do they like having those sort of like deadlines and we want to accomplish X by X, in which case like a 2-week sprint might be really effective for them. It might feel really motivating for them. For other teams, that feels like really, really, really stressful, and they want, sort of like a slightly longer time frames, looking more feature or like phase focused. What communication do not people outside of the engineering team need, right? How are you sort of like reporting up and out? How are you looking at what's working and what's not working on a team? I think for all of those aspects, you can take parts and pieces. Like, okay, this part of Agile works really well for this company. This part of Kanban, this part of ShapeUp. You can sort of modify them all in different ways, or you can say we're going to take most of Agile, but this part of Kanban, or most of ShapeUp, but this part of Agile, for example, right? You don't have to just follow a sole methodology and say like, well, this is what we're doing. Everybody read up on this, and that's what we're going to follow, by the book. You can create the process that works really well for your company and for your team, as long as you document it in a how we work document. I think that's actually like the miss. Is that it's easier if you say like, we do Agile or we do whatever, and then people can do their own research. If you sort of hodgepodge, you have to have it documented. Otherwise, people are like, wait, what are we doing? We're doing sprints, but we're also doing like this part of this thing. And can anyone explain to me like what the expectations are supposed to be? And, those sorts of things. So always document and update, right? Every time that you iterate, you say like, okay, this is working, this is not. How are we iterating? Update that how it worked doc.
This was a far more satisfying answer than you thought it would be.
Good. I'm always like, oh, my answer is it depends. And that's not a great answer.
It always depends. Now, meetings. What do they depend on? How do we create a culture, where deep work is encouraged, where developers get more time for uninterrupted work, and then at the same time have the necessary meetings to coordinate on important things?
Yeah. Okay, I could talk about meetings all day. And this is actually like a topic that I advise about frequently, is people will book time with me because they're like, I have this meeting, I hate running it, or like, I hate attending it. Like, how do we make it better? I do a conference talk a little bit about meetings and meetings facilitation. And I have this one slide at the very beginning that just says in really big letters, like, so many meetings suck. And the number of times that like from the whole talk, like that's the picture that like people have like, snapped on their phone and like shared out, it's great. But also true, right? I think one of the reasons why engineers say the worst part of their day or like interrupting their flow are meetings is because a lot of the meetings that they have to attend are run relatively poorly. I think that like there isn't a good understanding. There are these meetings that get set and then just happen, or it's like, oh, we're having an issue with coordination. Let's make sure to coordinate every week. We're going to do this meeting and it's going to help us coordinate. Okay, cool. How is it going to help you to coordinate? What does everybody need to walk away from that meeting with? What does everybody need to come to that meeting with? Right? I think there's like a lack of deep thinking that sometimes happens with meetings because we just don't have time to like think deeply about everything and how we're running everything. But then you feel right, and then that time goes up and up and up as more meetings are added, or as like meetings, unproductive meetings. It's like, okay, well, that didn't get me what I needed. So we'll have that meeting and we'll have a follow-up meeting and an additional meeting. So I think, thinking about why a meeting is taking place, if a meeting has to take place, which is, I think for some teams, working async is really effective. And for others, it is more difficult, and it is really, really helpful to like just have everyone, like, what can be a 48 or 72 hours of Slack conversation and back and forth and a thread that's 150 messages long. Like, honestly, sometimes you can grab those same people and have a 15-minute conversation with a really tightly focused, this is the goal, this is what we want to walk away with, can shortcut all of that. So I never take the stance that like all meetings are bad, but really understanding like, why is this meeting taking place? What you're doing in that meeting, how you're crafting the purpose, how you're enabling people to come prepared to that meeting, and then how you make it interactive and engaging. So we think about offsites as these sort of longer, these multi-day experiences and how we really want to put a lot of effort into those. But also we should be periodically stopping to think about what is the engagement factor with some of these like regular meetings. What do they look like? Sometimes they start out really engaging and then they sort of end up feeling like they're checking the box. And it's like, okay, in that moment, you have to pause and reassess and figure out like maybe you've actually accomplished the goal that the meeting initially was trying to accomplish. Does the meeting still have to happen? Is there a new goal that needs to be understood as to why that meeting is happening?
Developer experience. So you're talking about performance, team productivity, and developer experience has a direct impact on the output. And we mentioned tech debt a bit earlier, focusing on working on that part of the code versus new features and the excitement or lack of it brings to the team. But how do you balance both? How do you keep the team morale? How do you keep a culture where people are dedicated to paying back their debts, on time, so that it doesn't pile up and they don't need to spend that much time working on code they don't like?
I think that there are little things that can be done, right? There are things like bug bashes. There are things like how you're taking a week here and there as time for engineers to sort of work on the items that they want to. I think also in terms of like having that innovation, right? And making sure that you're still making time for that, right? Having engineers really understand customer pain points and having the ability to sort of like brainstorm ideas to solve those problems. I think that that's like one of those falls more in the innovation bucket. The other falls more in sort of like the, tech debt, more, like, okay, how are we taking care of these bugs? How are we making time for some of these larger technical problems that help maintain morale? I think that also, though, I think that part of this is having a really clear picture on what the tech debt is, right? I think that tech debt sometimes is a morale downer because it feels endless and it feels big and it feels painful and bothersome, right? And I think as software engineers, we want to build things to the best of our ability and also never get the actual time to build things like to perfection or to the best of our ability, because it doesn't make sense from a company perspective to like make everything perfect. Because for customers to use a product, to use a feature, to use whatever, like it doesn't have to be perfect, right? On the engineering side, it has to feel perfect to them. But like what feels perfect to them and what is perfection from a customer's perspective is not perfection from an engineer's perspective. And so one of the workshops that I frequently do with engineering teams is about tech debt and really helping them visualize and understand all of the tech debt that they have and the impact and effort around that tech debt, because like knowing what it is and how it's impacting the code base is the first step to helping them sort of like make it not feel endless and make it not feel like, oh, everything is so painful and so difficult. And also doing that lays the groundwork for how to effectively advocate for prioritizing that tech debt and what that looks like, so that it takes it from tech debt being like a drag on morale to sort of like putting it in perspective and making it actually like tackleable or actionable. And sometimes through talking about that with the larger team, a piece of tech debt that one person felt like was a really big deal, they understand that actually nobody thinks is a big deal. And so they can be like, oh, yeah, in perspective, this piece isn't a big deal, right? So it also helps them feel like not everything is like, high issue. It's sort of like, okay, this is impacting me a lot. It doesn't, in the grand scheme of things, actually not. Or the other place is where and how you can factor tech debt into features and work that's coming up. So having that really clear picture of tech debt, sometimes we're able to then triangulate and say like, well, we know this is going to happen 2 quarters from now on the product roadmap. And this is a low effort, high impact item on like that we've mapped as tech debt. Let's put that into the scope because we're going to be in that area of the code base anyway. And it's a great way to tackle both sort of at the same time without tacking on a whole bunch of extra time solely for tackling tech debt.
The final thing on my list of major things that impact performance metrics. What's your take on it? Too controversial to even elaborate.
No, I love metrics. I think that metrics are super, super important. To me, the most important thing, and where I think metrics get, I guess, like weaponized in a way, is like when metrics are taken out of context, or when like one metric is seen as like the sole end all be all, right? To me, like metrics tell a story, and that story that I need to know is, how is my engineering team performing and what's impacting their ability to perform even more effectively. So I will say that I'm pretty partial to space metrics as opposed to Dora metrics, because I think that space metrics take into consideration a lot more of that like developer perspective and that developer experience, and accounts for what the perception of something is, because I think that perception can be reality, right? If somebody perceives something in a certain way, that is their reality. And until you can undo that or explain or improve that, that perception from them is their reality. And so I think space metrics like do a really great job taking a lot of that into consideration and incorporating some of the people stuff into those, into the quantitative. But it's really a matter of like, I think boosting morale also around metrics is, how are those metrics being used, right? I think people are so afraid of how metrics are being used. Are we going to count points? Are we going to like measure velocity? And if it goes up or down every week, are we going to get a talking to, right? Like what does that look like? And so I think explaining, like, for me, at least with teams, these are all of the metrics that I look at. This is how I look at each of the metrics. This is the story that I try to put together around bottlenecks and performance and perception, et cetera. And then how is that becoming actionable, right? When we look at patterns month over month for specific metrics, if we see an upward pattern or a downward pattern, how are engineering managers, CTOs, like basically at every level, how are we taking action on that? Are we looking to improve? Otherwise, it sort of feels like, cool, we're just like tracking a bunch of stuff for the sake of tracking a bunch of stuff. But it's like, if it's like, no, we've noticed that flow is going down, right? And people feel like they have too many meetings and they can't actually get into flow. What should we experiment with? Are meetings being scheduled in the middle of the day? Should we move them to the start of the day, to the end of the day? Like, what is the micro action that can be taken to see if that metric improves? Because that metric improving will potentially impact pull request review time, which will potentially impact cycle time as a whole, right? And so that's sort of how I like look at and think about metrics. It's about being transparent, with folks as to what I'm looking at, how they're being used, having them see positive actions as a way, because then they also see metrics as a good thing. They don't see metrics as a way to track them and how like efficient of a cog are you in the machine, but it's really about like, okay, how can we make your day-to-day experience better today than it was yesterday, than it was a month ago, than it was 2 months ago. And yeah, so that's like what is the story that it's telling, and why do we want that story, and what are we doing with that story?
That's great. The whole conversation was great. I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much for joining me. Any final advice for people listening today?
Yeah, I mean, if I haven't said communication enough, it's like no, but I think final advice is I think engineering leadership, especially this sort of, CTO, VP of engineering, et cetera, level, it's not always about what you see immediately. It's about understanding and learning what's underneath that and how to get to that level and get to that layer. And then also how to solve those problems. And fill those gaps in ways that hopefully don't feel like huge shifts, but are more sort of like micro changes in a process where things are getting better, almost without people even fully knowing or realizing they're getting better until they're like, oh, this actually is no longer a pain point. So I think there's always we are problem solvers. We like to jump into the things that we see as problems. And I think there's surface, like there's what we hear, and then there's really thinking deeper. This is, where I talk about like offsites and having a goal, but there's the surface level goals of like, okay, we want people to get to know each other. We want to have a highly productive team, but then like, why? What does that mean? And how do we actually get there?
Great. Thank you once again, Allison.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
CTO Insights is brought to you by Adiva. To learn more about how we support innovative tech teams, visit adiva.it. Don't forget to subscribe to CTO Insights on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Substack, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Thanks for tuning in.